Good evening, you're watching NewsX with me, Devika Chopra. After concluding a fruitful trip to Nigeria, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is now in Brazil. The Prime Minister is attending the 19th edition of the G20 Summit in Rio de Janeiro as a Troika member, where all, of course, remember India's successful presidency of the G20 last year. The Delhi Declaration, a forward-looking document, highlighted several issues related to sustainable growth, technological transformation and women-led development. Additionally, the summit was marked by the inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member. Now, as a Troika member, India is expected to play a significant role in shaping the agenda of the summit this year as well. Brazil's president is aiming to maintain the summit's focus on Global South priorities, expecting to build momentum. The summit's agenda this year revolves around social inclusion, the fight against hunger, sustainable development, energy transition, and the reform of global governance institutions. However, with the world witnessing two wars being fought simultaneously, it is natural that these aspects will be at the forefront of the G20 summit as well. Meanwhile, all eyes are of course on Prime Minister Modi's bilateral with the Brazilian President Lula on the sidelines of the summit. But what does all of this really mean? I take this conversation forward. I have with me Ambassador Deepak Vora. We have with us Rabindra Sachdev, International Affairs expert, Pathikrit Payne, Geopolitical analyst, and Joyita Basu, editor of the Sunday Guardian. Let me begin with Ambassador Deepak Vora. Ambassador Vora, your key expectations from the G20 summit this year?
Thank you very much, ma'am. Always a pleasure to be with you on your amazing channel, to learn from you, from Mr. Rabindra Sachdev, from Mr. Payne, and of course from Ms. Basu, all of whom know much more than I do about this. Now, what are my expectations from G20 Brazil? Zero. We've had so many summits, we have these beautiful declarations, they are forgotten. The biggest takeaway, I believe, that we can expect is this global alliance against hunger and poverty. Why do I say that? Of all the countries in the world, we, Bharat, have the best expertise on tackling hunger and poverty on our own, with a virtuous mix of policy, skill, technology, confidence, and determination. Other than that, he'll talk about a global tax on billionaires, and he'll talk about social impact funds, and so on and so forth and so forth. The reality is today, ma'am, the group of 20 nations, now 21 if you include, this will be the first time, by the way, that the African Union will be attending as a full participant. If you take a look at how it is developing, I see two things. The BRICS thing, you know, that the fellows who make all those BRICS, that is being considered by its members, and I've attended their meetings, as an answer to this racket called the Group of Seven, which thought that they would determine the future of the world. They're all rubbish now. The BRICS meetings, the BRICS itself might evolve as an answer to that. Whereas G20, in my assessment, is probably a substitute for another racket, an 80-year-old dowager based in New York. She's going to be 80 next year. It's called the United Nations, totally disunited. So I see these two parallel movements, and G20 will continue to be, you know, the G7, ma'am, were in a company, they were the management. And then we had the group of 77 developing nations, which is now 123, they were the workers. So G20 in many ways was a meeting point, was in between the workers and the management. That, I believe, is the role it's going to continue to play. But the United Nations is useless. Nobody listens to them. As somebody told me when I joined the Foreign Service, it's both useless, pointless, purposeless, and everything less. So my own feeling is now that the expectation here, the global alliance and all these other ancillary things, this will be the biggest thing, because Lula wants to lay down his legacy. He wants to create a legacy and say, look, we fought against poverty, and this is what happened. Nothing is going to happen subsequently. Everybody is going to come asking for money. G20 doesn't have money, so they'll be coming bilaterally to me and asking for my help, that is what I expect.
Okay, Pathikrit, bringing you into the conversation, would you agree with the ambassador's assessment of the G20? And perhaps an interesting point raised there, I was thinking the same as far as the comparison with the United Nations is concerned. Are the G20 countries somewhere continuing their focus on aspects of sustainability and hunger? And of course, these are everyday problems that countries must come together to discuss and figure out ways forward on. But is there an inability right now within the G20 to also discuss some other important global events that are going on? For example, the war, or the fact that soon there will be a Trump presidency in the United States of America. What will that really mean for the rest of the world? What will that mean for the wars? Why do you think the G20 does not entirely touch upon these subjects, even though the heads of which are considered to be the 20 most powerful nations come together?
Devika, good evening. First and foremost, it's always entertaining and at the same time a great learning time when to hear Ambassador Bora, both at the same time. And I 100% agree with what Ambassador Bora said. Let me tell you the reason. Number one, the reason why G20 in 2023 was successful was not because of G20, but because of the clout of India and because of the individual persona of Prime Minister Modi and his whole and his charisma, his connections, his reputation in the world. The problem with G20 is this. Now, if I don't have trust in United Nations and if I have to look for an alternate, where is the address of G20? G20 cannot be just a forum every year they meet and have party and then move away and wait for the next year. It cannot be like that. So if they're very serious, then it has to have a secretariat. It has to have a permanent secretariat. It has to have a permanent building first and foremost. It cannot be just talk and only talk. So what I believe is this. Individually, countries like India will do and is doing far more than what G20 has done. And at the same time, let me tell you, if African Union was included in G20 last year, it was by India, not by G20. I think there was a lot of reluctance on the part of the developed countries of global north to sit in the same table with African Union, whom they still believe as a colonized entity. So I think India is definitely a benchmark in terms of energy transitions, in terms of democratizing telecommunication, in terms of democratizing digital finance. But I think they look up to what the global south looks up to India more than G20. For whether it is G20 this time. Look at the Voice of Global South Summit, which is headed by India. They are looking up to India as an alternate to actually pitch forward and ask for reforms in multilateral institutions. Now, I don't expect Biden to come and say that, oh yes, G20, G7 is useless and United Nations is useless.
Yes.
We are fighting 2 wars which could have been avoided. They will not do that. And they have their own terrible agenda in pushing climate change and yet not making the climate change technology available free of cost. They will not give it because it's business for them. So let me tell you this. Yes, BRICS is definitely an alternative. And if you see countries within G20 individually, especially the developing countries like India or say even China and Russia have done far more than G20 as a group. Because the problem, the ghost of G20 lies within G20 itself. It is the global north which will keep on ensuring that the status quo is maintained and United Nations is never replaced by any other forum. Back to you.
Okay, Rabindra Sachdev, does the G20, in your opinion, have the potential to perhaps slowly and steadily replace the United Nations and rectify some of the historical errors that were made through the course of the United Nations and its life, wherein there are just such strict laws in place which hamper to bring in the realities of today's world, that don't allow the United Nations to extend a seat on the Security Council to nations that truly do matter in today's world. So some of those historical errors that continue within the United Nations, do you feel that the G20 as a grouping has the potential to really address that?
Thank you, Devika. I mean, a deep question. I mean, yes and no, but more no. I mean, anything is possible, in the world there are 2 kinds of thinking. Possible, I mean, tonight the sun may arise again or become black, blue, pink, whatever, it is possible. But what is the probability of the sun becoming blue just now? Probability is virtually close to 0, right? So, I mean, the probability of the G20 to take on that kind of a, mantle, I think is virtually 0. But what is happening, as all your eminent, guests are mentioning, is that there is a vacuum, there's an absence in this architecture due to what the UN could have been, should have been playing. Now, in the absence or in the absence or inability of the UN to be doing anything virtually, of course, in some areas, UN is doing something. One could say, okay, in WHO, maybe it needs a lot of reform, but there has to be a global agency or the FAO, Food Organization and all. We need those organizations, though definitely reformed and leaner and meaner, etc. We do need those kind of things, right? But in the broad charter of the UN as such, and the UN Security Council, it is totally absent. And G20, I doubt, in fact, BRICS, though is quite far, but BRICS could, could be maybe more nimble and more agile. But then BRICS has its own internal, calculus, dynamics. There are countries with some diverse
contradictions, right? When it comes to BRICS, there are internal contradictions with India and China being there on the same platform, which is something that nobody is really able to address. But go on, Rabinder Sachev.
Yeah, sure. So therefore, the discussion that what is BRICS, is it a anti-Western bloc, or as Putin says and several could say, is that it's a non-Western bloc, right?
Yes.
But even if it becomes a non-Western bloc, quote unquote, with India's active participation and leadership of the global South, still that leads from a global perspective the West out, right? So if there has to be a world organization, it has to be one, in a theoretical sense, which envelopes, which the UN was supposed to be. But UN absolutely no chance of reform anywhere. None of these 5 countries who have the present veto will ever give up their veto. None of them is going to dilute their power by bringing in 1 or 3 or 4 other co-equal members. So the expansion of the UN Security Council, I see absolutely, nowhere on the horizon. That means the UN is kind of stuck where it is. But at the same time, the world is facing all these challenges. As colleagues have pointed out, poverty and hunger. What's happening on that, the stopping of wars, where is humanity headed? Energy security, cyber, terror, all of those. So what seems to be happening, and financial networks, dominance of, let's say, the US on the SWIFT networks. They can switch off your tap and tomorrow you cannot be transacting, your banks cannot be, transacting any import-export monies with any other bank in the world. Why? So these financial networks, multiple other, dimensions, I think what's happening, each one of these groups is, albeit, doing something towards those. G20 may be doing something, BRICS may be addressing some of those. So it's moving or morphing into a hodgepodge.
Yes.
Steps by BRICS, G20. Remember the SCO also?
Yes.
Okay, there's a SCO also.
That's what Rabinder Sachev, at the end of the day, when you think about it, there are just groupings after groupings after groupings. You've yourself listed 5 or 6 of them. So, interesting point raised there. Before I bring in Joyita, Ambassador Deepak Vora wants to make a point.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I have tremendous respect for Mr. Sachdev. I hear something which I'm not able to absorb. The UN is doing some work. We need something like this. Second sentence, it's completely useless. You're welcome to keep useless things in your home. They are doing good work. It's an 80-year organization. I have nothing that is 80 years old in my home. I'm 73. If it was anything 80-year-old, I'll throw it out. Ma'am, I have read the Quran, I've read the Gita, I've read the Bible, I've read the Talmud, I've read the Granth Sahib. Nowhere does it say that these 5 corrupts will sit permanently in this racket called the United Nations and determine the fate of humanity. So either make up your mind, do we want it? We want to reform it. And at the same time, we say there will be no reforms while these 5 corrupts are sitting over there. I really don't understand.
Okay.
Throw it out. Let's build a new world order. And I believe G20 is the nucleus of that new world.
Okay, all right. Rabinder Sachev, yes, please.
No, I quite understand what Ambassador Vora says. I don't have any issues on that. But the thing is that, the UN has several agencies, there are multiple kinds of agencies which are structured for multiple global perspectives. Those need to be there either under the UN or any other.
Yes, what I believe, I've lost that line with Rabinder Sachev, but I think what he's trying to...
a lot of perspectives.
Yes, and I believe that you're also trying to talk more about some of the humanitarian agencies of the United Nations which do continue to provide crucial aid. Now, whether that's really reaching its targets, we're not too sure. I don't want to get into that right now, but I want to bring in Joyita Basu into the conversation. Joyita, as far as the G20 is concerned, in your assessment, in the sort of world that we are witnessing today, the geopolitics that we are witnessing today, is the world opening up more for these sort of global alliances, or are we looking truly at eras of strong bilateral relations?
No, you cannot possibly ignore all these alliances, or even for that matter United Nations also. You know, if trying to dismantle the UN and then try to form another organization, it's going to be like the reinventing the wheel, doesn't make any sense. What you need is reforms, and that is what many of these countries are talking about. It's not just India. In fact, one of the the agendas in this G20 is the reform of these these institutions in particular. So, when you are looking at whether G20 is, what exactly is the role of the G20 now, it is definitely, we have read the charter, we know why it was established. It was to some sort of establish some kind of a bridge between the developing nations and the emerging economies and the main economies. You see, I think the G20 has done that role to a large extent, but at the same time it is right to say that but for India and China, provided we call China a developing country, which China does to itself, but for these two countries, the voices from the so called global south, or because if you are looking at the developed countries as the global north, except for these two countries, no one else has the clout. Okay, now China is gradually anyway it's an outlier in a way, and it is standing out on its own. So, it is ultimately India, because one of the reasons why of course we are perhaps not discussing G20 in Brazil as much as we did last year. It is a fact, first of all, it is the tyranny of distance. Let us not forget that. I was when it came to say 2000, if I remember 2011, France was the G20 president, and as it happened, I was in France that year. They were so surprised that we Indians were just not interested in G20. Okay, we were talking about the bilateral relations. So, when it comes to that, a body like this, unless it is there in the host country, the interest will not be there anyway, and especially when it comes to India. Of course, when it comes to India, last year the G20 got discussed at the global level, because first of all we got the African Union into the thing, and then you remember everybody landed up here except for Xi Jinping. Mr. Biden, has he gone to G20 this time? No, he hasn't. So, the whole point is, so when you are looking at a situation like this, it ultimately matters which are the countries who are hosting it. So, even though you are talking about Brazil, next time it is going to be South Africa, there is no parity. Now, we are about to overtake Japan and become the 4th largest economy in the world. So, India brings its own weight to the table. So, it is but natural, I would say much more concrete decisions were taken, much more decisions that can eventually have bring in a lot of, India was able to bring the voice of the global south to the table. If you remember, Prime Minister Modi had travelled to one of those South Pacific island countries, and there the Prime Minister, he had touched the Prime Minister Modi's feet, and said that we are stuck between, one side there is China, one side there are these global north countries, we are stuck and we look up to you. He was not talking about Brazil and all, because if you look at it geographically also, Brazil is situated at a place from where it is very difficult for Brazil to have a major influence on the global south. Now, India has that advantage. So, without India and without India's active involvement, neither Brazil nor South Africa, no one can bring anything to the table.
But Joyita Basu, I want to understand then from you, in your assessment, does the G20 have the potential to fill the gaps which we've seen with global alliances and organizations like the United Nations? You said, you rightly pointed out that there's no point in reinventing the wheel. But if the United Nations is also talking about sustainability and hunger, and G20 is also talking about sustainability and hunger, who's really discussing some of the truly important geopolitical developments that are taking place?
Well, actually, when you are looking at the G20, its original mandate was, it was supposed to talk about just matters of economy. From there, it has expanded to a whole lot of other areas. Now, when you are looking at the UN, say for example, United Nations, you see, overall internationally UN has the mandate, UN can give, say for example, this SDGs, sustainable development goals that the UN has given by 2030, countries should try to fulfill all that. So, what I think these bodies can do is act together to ensure that overarching, I would say, mandate that the UN has to fulfill those goals. You see, these bodies can act as, I would say, path towards that. So,
Okay.
so that is one way of looking at it.
Okay, Pathikrit, I want to bring in Ambassador Bora. I'll give you the last word, but Pathikrit, I want to bring you into the conversation. I want to understand from your perspective as well. Then, do you feel that today's era is one of having strong bilateral relations, or is it an era of these global alliances? And do we then really need several of these alliances like G20, Quad, BRICS to take forward what the UN's missions are?
Foremost, G20 has been able to diagnose the problem that the Global South does need more attention, Global South does need parity, but G20 has not been able to give the solution, give the actual medicine. The medicine maybe we can give some time later, but I think BRICS, even Brazil has more faith on BRICS than G20, even though they are hosting it. That's my understanding. Secondly, look, nobody is saying that we should dismantle United Nations. All that is being said is this. United Nations is here to stay for good or for bad, but even the Prime Minister of India has stopped going to the UNGA. It shows that if you do not reform, then most of the countries will ignore you, and that is exactly what is happening. Tell me, there are two major conflicts going on right now. Does United Nations, after 80 years of its formation, till today, does it have a dispute resolution mechanism to prevent a dispute from taking the shape of a conflict? There, when they give food in Gaza, they were actually colluding with Hamas. Is that what we expect from United Nations? In case of COVID, what happened, we have all seen. Now, when the earthquake struck Turkey, at that point of time, it was India which went far ahead of UN bodies to actually go and actually give help to the people of Turkey, even though we have problems with Turkey geopolitically. So United Nations needs to reinvent itself. It has become nothing but a proxy of the global north. Tell me a single statement by the United Nations that the wars must stop, or are they waiting for the next salary? It is a huge bureaucracy which gets paid. It's a great place to work because you get fat salary. Otherwise, tell me how many countries actually look up to the United Nations to solve the problem? If it is not, then
Yes.
it doesn't have a relevance. It
Yes,
may
that's what-
exist.
but Pathikrit,
there
that
are
would
many PSUs which exist, but they don't have a relevance. There is a war going on in Israel. When they bomb Lebanon, the first guys to run away are the UN peacekeeping force.
Yes, but Pathikrit, I want to
There is
understand,
a
are you
conflict
saying that there are
past.
more countries, as far when you talk about respect for the United Nations, is there something that the G20 then needs to do or is doing right to get that respect which is missing from the United Nations? And the only reason why we're comparing the United Nations with the G20 is simply because of the number of nations that are there in the G20 currently. That's really the only reason.
Look, G20, you can raise issues which United Nations has ignored for a long time. Number one is this. You can say that the multilateral institutions must introspect. When Sri Lanka was in crisis, no multilateral financial institution came to help them. It was India. They must understand and introspect. Unilateral sanctions have a big impact. Talking about economic, G20 is about economy. Let me give you an example. When unilateral sanctions are imposed by United Nations or NATO or others, and UN keeps a mute spectator to that, it is the small countries which suffer the maximum. The reason why countries like Sri Lanka suffered and became bankrupt is because of the sanctions they imposed on Russia, as a result of which the price of several commodities went up. Just after the COVID, when their prime exports of tea and tourism went bust. So they had no foreign exchange reserve to buy the critical commodities at a high price. Now it's an economic issue. G20 must address this, but G20 talks about it, but it doesn't have a mechanism to address the issue.
Yes.
That's where the BRICS comes in, because the clout of countries matters a lot. You know the reason why NATO survives or United States survives is because United States ensures that dollar is protected by its military, not its by economy. because BRICS has the military capability, not that you need to go for a war, and the economic capability, that's why it is being taken seriously. G20 is good in diagnosis. It's a diagnostic center. It is not a doctor. That's all I can say.
Okay, Ambassador Deepak, will I leave the last word with you?
Well, ma'am, thank you very much. I heard Mr. Payne, he's brilliant. So is Mr. Sajde. I heard Ms. Basu speak, and she talked about these agencies wanting should work together. She's one of the should. हमने देखी है जन्नत की हकीकत, लेकिन दिल के खुश रखने को गालिब ये ख्याल अच्छा है. UN की agencies आपस में नहीं काम करती हैं. They are fighting for funds, etc. May I make a final suggestion, ma'am?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Kick out all the diplomats from that beautiful building in Manhattan, convert it into a nightclub, and it will do more for global harmony than it is doing now. I rest my case, my lord.
Okay, Joyita, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I would not be so cynical about it, because ultimately you need, if you do not have any, you see, G20, when it comes to the numbers are nowhere near what the UN numbers are. But yes, at the same time, there are countries, say for example, groupings like the G77. Let's put it this way, let's just look at it from India's point of view. What should we do? We have to just take up the leadership of the global south. You cannot allow China to usurp that position. Take the voices of the global south in whichever platform you are in. That includes the G20, all the other BRICS, wherever they are. The thing is that no, you are not getting rid of the UN, it is going to be there. So, you see, what do? You have to reform it, and that is where I think the most important point lies. The UN needs reforms. And by the way, when I am talking about the UN, because I have been following up this subject very closely, say for example, at an organization like the UNRWA, why they fail? Because they are so compromised, they are full of, say for example, Hamas people. That is the problem. Say UNIFIL, that's compromised because it is, under the UNIFIL offices you find Hezbollah bunkers, and the UNIFIL, the United Nations will say we don't know anything.
Yes.
So until and unless you change these, you reform these systems, there is no way that we are going anywhere.
Okay,
that is the
all right.
point.
Unfortunately, I've run out of time. The discussion was getting very heated and spicy, but that's all the time that I have, viewers. I thank all of our guests for joining us on this broadcast. With that, we slip into a very short break.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.